Herzlich willkommen zu 99 zu 1. Welcome to 99 zu 1. My name is Nadim. This is an English episode because today we have a very special guest in the house, Mr. Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis, welcome to 99 zu 1.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. We are honored to welcome Yanis Varoufakis. He's a distinguished Greek economist, politician. He is acclaimed, of course, and very well known for his role as Greece's Minister of Finance during the challenging government debt crisis a couple of years ago. And beyond his political career, Varoufakis is an accomplished author. Notable works are, for example, Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment. Very interesting obituary for Wolfgang Schäuble's death a couple of weeks ago, where there are also two quotes from that book. It's a very interesting book. I can really recommend it. Another one that I read, at least, was Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, which is also very interesting. Check that out. Currently, he's the Secretary General, I think one would say in English, of the MERA movement, or the DM movement, the DM party, DM25. And there it is. And yeah, he in this function, he actively shapes progressive and pan-European political agenda. He has also always been very vocal about Palestinian rights and has recently made some quite impactful statements on the on the basis of which he also got cancelled in Vienna, but we'll get to that in a second. Maybe, and that's also the reason why today we want to not speak about economy, not speak about Greece and the European Union in particular, but we want to talk a little bit about Palestine, Gaza, Israel, and of course also the role of Europe and Germany. First, maybe, Yanis, I will give you the stage. Give us your view on the events unfolding since October 7th. What has happened and where are we at today? What do you, how do you judge that?
Well, what we are seeing is the culmination, the apotheosis, the heightening of a very straightforward and extremely sad, depressing act of genocide. The Palestinian people are being subjected to what can only be described as genocide. This is not new. It didn't start on the 7th of October, of course, right? Because there is this very quaint myth that there was a ceasefire between the Palestinians and the Israelis before the 7th of October, and then suddenly Hamas attacked Israel and the war began. That's, of course, absolute rubbish. The war began in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of 800,000, 900,000 Palestinians during the Nakba, and it never stopped since then. Before the 7th of October, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza were in an open-air prison, in a prison camp. No access to the rest of the world. 60% of the children malnourished because of the embargo. Their water, their electricity, their food completely regulated by the occupying force, Israel, just because they had moved their troops out of Gaza, didn't stop Gaza from being occupied territory. If anything, it resembled, if anybody remembers that movie by John Carpenter, Escape from New York, where Manhattan became an open-air prison for, right, for the United States. This is exactly what it was. And on the 7th of October, I remember I was in Berlin when the Hamas attack against Israel took place. I made a name for myself, and as a result, I've been facing a wave, a tsunami of vilification, because I refused to condemn the Hamas attack. And the reason why I refused to condemn the Hamas attack in principle, right, while at the same time saying that any attack against civilians, whether by Hamas on Israeli civilians or by Israelis on Palestinian civilians, is deplorable and violates the Geneva Convention. But nevertheless, any people who have been incarcerated in an open-air prison not only have a right to break down that wall and to attack the army that is keeping them imprisoned, they have a duty to do it. In the same way that prisoners of war have a duty to escape, a population that is caught up in a mass prison camp, I would say concentration camp, I know this is a controversial term in Germany, but it has all the hallmarks, especially now for concentration camp, especially now. They have a duty to break out. It's, for progressives, for those who defend human rights, anybody's human rights, Israelis, Palestinians, people in Kashmir, people of Germany, human rights are either universally respected or they don't exist. For anybody who respects human rights, it's always very difficult to steer the right course between defending the right to resist occupation and condemning acts that go beyond the right to resist, like, for instance, rapes, the killing of civilians, taking of hostages, and so on. That was the difficulty. But it's a difficulty that either you face head-on or you become complicit in general. The difficulty was how to say, on the one hand, Hamas had every right to attack Israel. It didn't have the right to attack civilians.
So since then, what people here call a war has broken out, and we see, you already described that as at least genocidal acts at genocide. Now an ICJ court ruling has come through like 2 weeks ago that at least gives credibility to those claims made by South African politicians there. My question would be, even before that, I mean, looking at 2-3 months ago, the calamity has been ongoing, let's say. Why, and maybe as an ardent believer of, let's say, international law and human rights and ICC, ICJ, etc., why are all these structures so ineffective? Why could this just go on like this?
Well, to begin with, let me contest the word war. This is no war. There's a war in Ukraine between two independent countries, Russia and Ukraine. There's no war in Palestine. It's not a state. It's not a functioning. It's not. Gaza is not a state. Hamas is not a government. Gaza, the West Bank, where just before you and I began talking, Israeli troops disguised as Palestinians entered the hospital in Jenin and executed 3 patients, 3 Palestinians in their beds. That's not a war. That's a crime. That's just criminal activity by an occupying force. If only the Palestinians had a state that could wage war. They don't. So let's be clear on this. Why is the international system of legislation and human rights not functioning? Well, the answer is very, very clear. Because the West never cared about human rights or international law. Never. It was always a facade. The United States, Britain, all the European colonial powers, France, Italy, Germany, used the language of human rights as a weapon of colonization. They always did it in their own countries. Think about the Constitution of the United States, which is a beautiful text, the Bill of Rights. It reads like poetry, a celebration of human rights and the rights of man and woman, one assumes. And yet the very same authors of that beautiful document who wrote poetically about freedom were slave owners. So for them, freedom was very precious for their own caste, for their own class, for their own ilk. But it involved the freedom to have slaves, the freedom to settle other people's lands and to treat them like vermin, to extend the logic of terra nullius in Latin. Terra nullius means empty land, a land without people. Because if you think about it, when the British went to Australia, they declared that Australia is terra nullius, that there are no people here, even though there were 6 million Aborigines. Immediately, what you do when you declare Australia to be terra nullius is you claim that the people there are not humans, therefore you can kill them and you can take their land since there are no humans there. I'll remind you of the most central Zionist line of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century: land without a people, for a people without a land. That was Palestine. Terra nullius, land without a people. So the Palestinians are not people, therefore you can kill them. The British did this in Kenya, in South Africa, in Australia, and so on and so forth. The Americans have done it in America. They did in Canada. On one hand, championing human rights with great texts like, John Locke's or, the Federalist Papers, right? But not for the people that it wants to expropriate. And the Palestinians fall under the category of those people that need to be expropriated in the interests of anti-Semitic Westerners. Because let's not forget, people like myself, maybe you, I don't know. I hope you're not being vilified as much as people like me are. But people like myself, right? Because we are anti-Zionist, because we are pro-Palestinian, because we are pro-human rights, pro-universal human rights, we're being called anti-Semites. But the true anti-Semites are the Zionist supporters who really wanted to get rid of Jews from Europe. And they said, okay, you go to a land without the people. So that's a double crime. Firstly, they wanted to get rid of the Jews, to take them far away. And secondly, to deny the Palestinians the right to be called humans. So that, when we talk about, the international law, what are we talking about? We're talking about the agglomeration, the encapsulation of this mindset of settlers, of Western settlers, whose job it is to get rid of the natives, to expropriate their land, to eliminate them, to ethnically cleanse them, while proclaiming their own human rights and their own political rights under the guise of supposedly universal human rights, which are only, if you think in purely racist terms, that the riffraff, the Palestinians, the Jews, the this, that, whatever, are not human beings. And it so happened that at some point, because of Israel's strategic position regarding Britain initially and then the United States, racists simply switched from being anti-Semitic, from being quite happy to see the Jews being killed, either in pogroms, or in the Holocaust, to see them being killed off, like the Native Americans before them, like the Aborigines in Australia. So we need to take a broader look at all these institutions. Now, I'm not saying that the institutions of the International Criminal Court, of the Court of Justice, of the United Nations are not important. It is important. Because this is how we make progress. The oligarchs, the few, the settlers, create institutions supposedly for human rights, supposedly for justice, whether these are the courts, the high courts, the Supreme Courts, or the international courts. They create them for their own purposes. And then the rest of humanity must wrestle those away from them and give them the substance that their creators never meant for them to have.
Let's say it like this. I would immediately try to maybe challenge this a little bit. Just towards your comment before, I'm half Palestinian myself, and we also cover Palestine extensively here, so we are very familiar with the anti-Semitism accusation here too. And of course, we also saw what you received in the last weeks. We're going to talk about this in a second. But coming back a little bit to what you just said, if the rulers of the world, let's say, I mean, in this case, it's basically the global north, or maybe what people would call the West. If those big rulers of the world set up these laws in order to, establish their control over the whole globe, and to be frank, I mean, one of the first, I think maybe the second or so, I'm not sure, human rights is the right to property, right? So we as communists, shouldn't we then be opposing that whole thing and say, not only is it a charade, but it's actually, I mean, even the content itself is a tool of this oppression, and we should be striving towards something else?
You see, it depends on how you define property, and the question is whose property. You see, the powers that be, the dominant forces, capitalists, they're only interested in preserving property which they have stolen. So, Australia was the property of Aboriginal people. They understood it as their land. It was, their collective property, communal property. Then the settlers came in, they stole it. And then suddenly they cared about property rights. But whose property rights? Their property rights. The property rights of the looters. So as Marxists, communists, socialists, whatever you want to call us, what we need to challenge is their concept of property.
Private property, maybe. Right?
The whole point about being progressive should be about reconstructing property rights, taking them away from those who have property rights because of their power, because of their looting, because of their, ownership of machines that can be used in order to extract other people's work without paying them the appropriate remuneration, and collectivizing property. I believe in property, but I believe in collective property, what used to be called the commons. But if you think of, if you think of Gaza, going back, Gaza is a common that somebody else wants. They just want it. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, it's a collective commons, a collective property that is in the radar screen of a settler power, of an imperialist power. They just want to get rid of the people whose property it is, and they want to loot it, and then divide it into private little properties. So they create a little California in the middle of the West Bank.
Yeah. No, I mean, in Gaza, there are indeed tourist agencies that are already making plans for creating villas on the beach. That already happened months ago.
Don't forget the natural gas. Don't forget the natural gas.
There is that too. Some word on the ICJ rulings. I mean, I noticed last week what was very interesting about them was that both sides, as well as pro-Palestinian people and pro-Israel people, could utilize them or try to utilize them as a win for themselves. So the Israelis would say, yeah, look, they didn't ask us to go for a ceasefire. The Palestinians would say, see, they said that there is plausible cause for genocide, and we should investigate this. How do you judge those rulings? Were they a win in terms of progress, or were they problematic? How do you judge them?
Oh, there's no doubt that it was a problematic, highly problematic verdict. It was a diplomatic verdict. It was the kind of decision a court makes when it doesn't want to make a decision. But even that is a victory for Palestine, because the Israelis, you see, they had a dilemma. Should they boycott the court or participate in the proceedings? They thought very hard about that, and they decided to participate. And they went to the court with one demand: that the court dismisses the case, just dismisses the case, out. And in that, Israel lost. The fact that they lost, because you see, in the court of public opinion in the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, the case has been dismissed. Our governments have become complicit in the genocide of the Palestinian people by dismissing out of hand the very word genocide, saying, no, we should not be even discussing that. And the International Court of Justice said, no, we should. So that is a major victory for Palestine, for Palestinians, and a defeat for the Israelis. But at the same time, it is the despicable decision, because they're just How can they sleep at night when they're on the one hand saying you need to send more aid to the Palestinians, but you don't have to stop bombing them? I mean, my goodness, how can you say that? You know, with a clear conscience? The answer is you can't.
Right. It would. I mean, otherwise, I also was in a lot of discussions with Palestinians before the rulings. Some people were actually hoping. I mean, most people were completely disillusionized and didn't expect anything from it. But some people were hoping for them to order a ceasefire. But then again, even if the ICJ ordered a ceasefire, this would not become effective before it goes to the UN Security Council, which would probably then been taken down by the US there. So what does this tell us about this whole thing in general? I mean, is that, coming back to your charade, what do we learn about these whole systems and institutions when we look at that?
That power rules fully, right? Hard power and soft power. But we should not diminish the significance of the verdict that came out, or even more, if a cease and desist in order to
would have come out, yeah.
A ceasefire had been reached or issued, that would have been even much, much better. What difference would it make? It would make a difference. It would make the role of Olaf Scholz much, much harder. It would make it harder for him to dismiss the case for a ceasefire. It would create consternation within the Greens. It would, in Germany, it would create a lot more consternation within the Democrats on the run-up to the presidential election in the United States, because Biden can feel that his support amongst young Democrats or young people who might have voted for him come November of 2024, that this support is leaking out, and not leaking to Trump, but leaking to abstention, to not voting. So these are the real forces that are unfolding and evolving and changing shape and direction under the surface. So we must not scoff at the significance of these symbolic successes or failures.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Europe's, and in particular maybe Germany's, reaction to all of this. I mean, you were here on October 7th, and also since then you have, of course, witnessed what's going on. Maybe first describe a little bit what you see. How did Germany react to this whole calamity, and why?
A comrade of ours, a friend of ours, Iris Heffetz, who lives in Berlin, is an Israeli Jew who practices as a psychoanalyst in Berlin. A few days after the 7th of October, she came out on the street in Berlin on her own, completely on her own, with a placard that she had actually written on, as an Israeli and as a Jew, stop the massacre in Gaza. This is an Israeli Jew. And there comes a bunch of German white policemen and women and arrested her for spreading anti-Semitism. You can't make this up. White, Aryan, German police arresting an Israeli Jew for spreading anti-Semitism because she's saying, not in my name as a Jew should a massacre take place. I don't think I need to add more. I think that is the situation in Germany. It is absurd. Now, why is this happening? It is happening for a number of reasons. Of course, there is a collective guilt in Germany, as there should be, over the Holocaust. I think that this is a very good thing. I think Germans should bear a collective guilt over the Holocaust. I think that all Europeans should bear a collective grief and guilt over the Holocaust, because it wasn't just the German Nazis. It was the Croat Nazis, it was the Serb Nazis, it was the French Nazis, it was the Dutch Nazis, it was the Lithuanian Nazis, it was the Polish Nazis, it was the Greek Nazis that partook in the execution of the Holocaust. The whole of the European continent is tainted by anti-Semitism, by pogroms before the Nazis even came around, and of course by the Holocaust. But the question that I pose to my German friends is, how many rivers of Palestinian blood, how many of those does it take to wash off your guilt over the Holocaust and allow you to say, never again, even for the Palestinians? To what extent are you going to tolerate the genocide of the Palestinians in order to extinguish your guilt over the Holocaust, so that you can at some point say, no more genocide of the Palestinians? And I get no answer to that. And it seems to me that, so that's one aspect of it. The other aspect to this is that you have a complete breakdown in anything that could resemble European sovereignty when it comes to foreign policy. You see, once upon a time, we had politicians in Germany, in France, here in Greece, who were pro-NATO, they were pro-American, they were representatives of their capitalist class, but could nevertheless stand up to Israel, even mildly. I remember, for instance, Jacques Chirac, the president of France, or Willy Brandt before that, who were very strongly opposed to anti-Semitism, who had supported Israel's right to exist and all that, but at the same time, who looked the Israeli officials in the eye and said that what is happening in the occupied territories is unacceptable. Jacques Chirac, in the occupied territories, physically confronted the Israeli army. I can't imagine this happening today with Olaf Scholz or with Jacques Chirac or with the Greek Prime Minister. We have politicians in power whose incapacity to contest not so much Israel, but the will of Washington, D.C., American hegemony. Effectively, they defer to Washington, whatever Washington says. They're expecting the Washington line and then just tow it. That, I think, reflects very significantly the complete loss of European capitalism's autonomy from the United States after the 2008 great financial collapse. After 2008, the flimsy structure of the European Monetary Union gave rise to a series of domino effects. First, it was the German banks. It was Deutsche Bank, Finanzbank, and all the other German banks that went bankrupt because of the stupid bets they had placed on the American subprime market. And that domino effect took down every single European bank. There wasn't a single European bank in early 2009 which was not bankrupt. That immediately triggered a bankruptcy of states, with Greece being the first one. Then it was Ireland, it was Portugal, it was Italy, it was France, Spain, and so on, right? And the reaction to this deep crisis of European financialized capitalism was a kind of political program which I sum up as socialism for the bankers and harsh austerity for everyone else, including the German working class. That created a collapse in investment, a very large increase in the amount of money available because the central banks were printing money. So you've got a lot of money and very little demand by the little people. And that created a deep recessionary undercurrent with lots of money for the rich. So inequality increased, and you had a social democratic left that had gone to ground. It was complicit in this. They were part and parcel of this. So all the discontent, who could express it? The ultra-right, the xenophobes, the fascists, who sided with Israel against the Muslims. So anti-Semitism was traded for Islamophobia. In this context, with the United States recovering because they had a solid political and monetary system, unlike Europe, which doesn't have a solid political and monetary system. They have the Fed. The ECB is nothing like the Fed. They have the federal government. They have, they can sit around the table and make a decision like that. Whereas the European Union supposed leaders, they can talk for hours, and they simply do as they're told in the end by bureaucrats. And so the result of this inane handling of the inevitable Euro crisis, as I call it, was the complete loss of European sovereignty. The European capitalism became a vassal. It was always a vassal to American capitalism, but it became far, far more. And that is reflected in our politicians. That's why no politician in Europe, even if, let's say that, Olaf Scholz has an epiphany and suddenly sees the light about Palestine, he won't be able to say anything. Because the whole of the media structure in Germany, the whole of the media structure in France, the whole of the military-industrial complex, the way in which Germany has been, the German business model is now kaput as a result of having to buy very expensive Texan gas instead of much cheaper Russian gas. I'm not arguing the case for going back to Gazprom, but I'm simply being objective in my analysis. He would be able to say that, what he thinks. Macron, I have no doubt, and Scholz think that what's happening in Ukraine is a crime against logic. The forever war against Russia until Moscow falls. That's a stupid idea. I'm sure Scholz and Macron believe that. They would never be able to say it. Unlike what was going on before 2008, when even Schroeder and back then Sarkozy, said no to the invasion of Iraq. They would never be able to do that. And that's because after 2008, Europe has become the stupid continent. I believe that seriously. I've seen it in action, even for a very few months when I was, in Brussels and in Berlin and so on. I saw them making decisions which they knew were detrimental to the interests of the capitalist classes of Europe, and not being able to coordinate into making decisions which were in their own interests. That's why I'm calling it the stupid continent, our Europe.
It does sound a little bit like, not to contest what you said, but it does sound a little bit like the German state would not have any rationale for his policies towards Israel. One thing is, of course, the whole moral story about, that's also, by the way, it's a huge factor in building the identity and the national consciousness of Germans in general, which is the guilt towards Israel. But at the same time, is it then really against their interest what they're being, are they being forced to take such a proactive and pro-Israel stance in this conflict? Sometimes you even believe, especially when you look at the media, that the Germans are outrunning the US in terms of support for the Israelis. So how do you make that work?
Look, these are very complicated processes. So there's not a single silver bullet kind of answer to answer it all. There's a conjunction of forces, and you're quite right. There is agency. German politicians could be less gung-ho about Israel than they are. So I don't want to whitewash them by saying that they cannot, they have no alternative. They are simply subject to forces beyond their control. There are forces beyond their control, but there is also a very simplistic moral equilibrium that they have achieved in order to create, as you put it, the ideology of West Germany, which then spread to the rest of Germany after unification. There's no doubt about that. But look, if I remember Willy Brandt, because I'm getting old enough to remember Willy Brandt, and Bruno Kreisky in Austria, because Germany and Austria are the two countries whose post-war ideology has been framed, as you put it, in terms of supporting Israel and collective guilt over the Holocaust, which I think is right. I think, having a collective guilt over the Holocaust is appropriate. It is right and proper. But Bruno Kreisky and Willy Brandt combined that with a support for a Palestinian state. They combined that with support for Palestinian organizations. Today, what you have in Germany is full complicity in the eradication of any claims on behalf of Palestinians. And that to me, is not simply the result of the post-war ideology, because Willy Brandt and Bruno Kreisky were part of that too. For me, this is a deeper issue. I mean, look. Let me take you somewhere completely differently, to a different realm. China. Germany is absolutely reliant on a good trade relationship with China. German capital is going to lose, and it's already losing, enormous capacities to reproduce itself, to accumulate, as a result of the new Cold War that Donald Trump began against China, and Joe Biden is turbocharging. German capital only has to lose from that. The German capitalist class has every reason to oppose America and its pursuit of the new Cold War against China, because this new Cold War against China, which comes with euphemisms like de-risking and deglobalization and so on, that's the death knell of the German business model, especially after the European periphery has stopped having the capacity to absorb the net exports of German industry. And those net exports can only go to China. And German companies need to develop, for instance, Volkswagen is hiring, as we speak, 3,000 Chinese engineers to develop autonomously driven and battery-driven cars in China, because there is a dearth of engineers in Germany. And yet, Washington proves daily its capacity to force upon the German political elites participation in increasing the pace of the conflict between the West and China. So you see what I mean? The German capitalist class, the German political class, which represents the German capitalist class, are simply being railroaded by the interests of the American ruling class and the American political class in policies, foreign policies, that are not in the interest of the German capitalist class. Now, I think the same thing applies to Israel and Ukraine. Israel, Ukraine, China are three such brilliant examples, I think, of where German rulers, whether they are economic rulers or political rulers, are being railroaded into following policies which are not in their own interests.
Okay. Then maybe I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm making like a little bit of a jump here, but I think we can still connect it to what you just said. If what you just said is holds, and then we have all these institutions that are being used, kind of used as, oh, now it's my turn. Sorry for that are being used by these powers for their interest, especially the West, or maybe how you put it, the United States' interest. And then we have the situation in which all of this culminates in, kind of total impunity for Israel to do what it is doing right now. What is the solution to all of this? I mean, I'm asking you now, of course, to in 2 minutes solve the Middle East conflict, but maybe maybe you have an idea what the solution would be, and if there is even a realistic solution to all of this that turns out to be, beneficial, at least for the people in Gaza.
The only ally humanism has is the capacity of inhumanity, of racism, of imperialism to undermine itself. The only silver lining I see in this preposterous suffering of the Palestinian people is that the events of the last 3 months, 4 months, have made it impossible that we will continue along the lines that we had before of the Palestinians being ethnically cleansed and eradicated at a slow pace without the world looking at them. If there is one thing that is giving me heart and hope of what's been happening the last 4 months, is that the Arab world, the corrupt regimes of the Arab world, would no longer be able to make peace with Israel while ignoring the Palestinians. The crisis, the massacres, the ongoing quick-pace genocide is capable of creating within Israel as well, within Saudi Arabia, within Egypt, within Germany, to create a new process that will one day, I hope, that's the only hope that we've got left, bestow upon the Palestinian people rights which they are now missing, and they've been missing since 1948. What was going on before 7th of October? You see, I really want to challenge the idea that everything was fine until Hamas decided on the 7th of October to attack Israel. Nothing was fine. The world was being complicit in turning a blind eye to the slow asphyxiation of the Palestinian people. So let us just hope that this acute increase in the pain of the Palestinians is going to bring about the end of the slow genocide and the beginning of new forces. You see, I'm a humanist. I believe I have a stupid optimism about human nature. I'd like to think that some of the soldiers now of the IDF, who are in Gaza killing people indiscriminately, who are in Jenin today in the hospital killing people, so on. When they demobilize and they go back home to Tel Aviv, to Haifa, to wherever, they will start having sleepless nights over what they've done, of what they were ordered to do. When I see the former director of Mossad coming out in The Guardian with an interview in which he confessed that they were imposing apartheid on the Palestinians, and that cannot be a sound basis for a good life for Israelis. That is the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
Okay. Yes. Here. Let's hope, because I think
let's keep fighting. Let's keep fighting without concern about being cancelled, about being called anti-Semites, when we are completely solidaristic with our comrades in Israel, Jews who are proving what it means to be anti-racist, in the same way that they were. Remember what Hannah Arendt said, that if there was one German who died in Auschwitz opposing the Hitler regime, then you can't blame Nazism on Germans. Similarly, as long as there is one Jew and there are many in Israel, who fights against apartheid, then you can't blame the Palestinian genocide on the Jews at large. What you can blame it on is the governments of the West, who are the main culprits in perpetrating the Palestinian genocide.
Yanis, thanks so much for visiting us. It was a great honor to have you here. Hopefully not the last time. And I wish you all the best, Yanis.
You too. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht, das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.